So I will keep an eye out for people who are arriving slightly late. But we've got a really, well, we always have interesting talks, but we've got a very interesting talk today from Andy Lomas. I'll let Andy do a little introduction to himself, but what I will say is that Andy has been involved in the Computer Art Society for many years. Is it heading towards 10 years, do you think, Andy?
Maybe not quite that, but yeah, heading for it. Probably on the longer end of that.
Okay, yeah. You're also involved in Flux events, and you're also a lecturer at Goldsmiths, and you're also other things as well. And I'm sure a number of you would have seen Andy's work. And I think what you're going to be talking about today is some new material, some new work you've been working on. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's sort of continuation. I sort of basically it's about trying to almost like research work that I've been doing actually together with John McCormack and his group down in Sensi Lab down in Melbourne, but also trying to put it more in the context of my art practice rather than just be doing like an academic paper.
Brilliant. Yeah. So what we will do is we'll do the same as we normally do, which is we'll try and keep the event down to an hour or so, which means probably 40 minutes talk. Would that suit you?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it to that.
Okay, and then we'll have a few questions at the end. If we decide, or if you want to stay a bit longer and Andy's happy to answer more questions, we can run a bit beyond what's going to be 9 o'clock for me, but we don't want to take up more than an hour or so. So I'll stop talking fairly soon. Towards the end, I will then just give you a summary, just to remind you again of what's happening next week. But for now, I think I'll hand you over to Andy Lomas. I'll make sure everything's recording. Yes, we even have 3 people watching on YouTube, so that's working. So over to you, Andy. Finally, I should say to people, I am recording this. If you ask questions at the end, they will go in the recording unless you don't want me to. But it's a very informal event, so hopefully you're happy for us to leave the questions in. So now I will hand over to Andy for the next half hour, 40 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Sean. It's a pleasure being here in these slightly strange times. But I guess it was nice, because the opportunity to do something from basically the attic space, which is where I sort of do most of my work. So this is, I guess, not what you normally see, but my sort of attic space up here with, I guess, my various 3D printer at the back and my 2D printer for doing 2D prints and things. And I've got various sort of sculptures up on the shelves and things like that, which I sort of been running off my 3D printer. So welcome to my studio, I guess. So yeah, basically I was sort of saying that what I'm going to try and talk to you today is kind of gets into some slightly different stuff than I usually talk about. But basically, I've been doing some research work with John McCormack and his group down at Monash in Melbourne. And we presented a paper actually just a few weeks ago. It's probably, I guess, one of the first conferences that had to go completely online with the coronavirus stuff. So we presented this first presentation was at a paper at Evo MuseArt about 3 or 4 weeks ago. But what I'm going to try and do is not just repeat the paper we gave at Evo MuseArt. I guess we'll go into some slightly technical things, but I hope we try and give much more the context of why we're doing this, how this fits in with my art practice and things like that. So it's going to be a bit about my art, a bit about welcome to my studio, and then into some of this latest work about basically trying to use deep neural nets in my so hope you take my art practice further. So I guess let's switch to share my screen. So screen share. Right, you seeing my screen hopefully? Is that coming through? Great, okay. So so basically, sort of slightly titled is sort of deep learning as a creative collaborator. So I guess one thing that I'm very interested in is this is using deep learning not as the thing that's up front. I guess a lot of people using GANs and things like that in machine learning in art. But this is more about how we're using deep learning was in the process of the creation of the things rather than it's being part of the final artifacts. The final artifacts are still on the sort of simulation systems that I use, which aren't deep learning based, but it's almost like using deep learning as part of the process of how I find things, how I work. So just a little bit of the context. So this is a project that I've been actually doing together with John and his group down in Monash. So basically, John McCormack, who I think quite a lot of you know, who's obviously does a lot of computational art in his own right, has got this really cool group down at Monash called Sensi Lab. And he invited me to go down there just over a year ago for a couple of weeks in the lab and working out whether there were sort of things which we maybe would be interested in working on together. And basically, there's some things I've been thinking about trying out deep learning for a while. This is like opportunity to say, okay, well, this is some things I'll be planning to do. Let's see whether this actually makes sense and works. So I also like to sort of shout out for Dilpreet Singh, who's one of the guys of people in John's group, who also did a lot of the original implementation of neural nets and things like that, and sort of like to help get this project going. So yes, well, the credits. So basically, into my practice, and I guess moving straight in, I haven't a huge amount of time. The core of what really motivates me and what I'm sort of, what is it what drives me, what am I trying to do in my art practice? And I guess one of the big questions for me was like the sorts of complex, rich systems that life is basically made up. So this maybe sounds slightly crazy, Dr. Frankenstein, but basically the sorts of things that, rich ingredients that life uses to make astonishingly rich things. So how it makes us, how it makes plants, how the stuff that evolution works on top of, almost the rich connections of chemicals and neuron sending signals, those sorts of things. Those are the things that really intrigue me. It's almost like, what can those sorts of rich ingredients do? And then can we always work with it creatively? Can we almost like nature shows that the astonishingly rich, complex things can happen if you mix together enough complex ingredients, and then sort of almost like tune the results through survival of the fittest, through evolution and things like that. Well, what was it like trying to work with those similar sorts of systems ourselves? So I guess I come from a maths background, and the idea of then basically using a computer to simulate similar and run that sort of rich, complex system. So I guess you call this a simulation, but I guess there's a thing when almost mathematically, I feel that it is the same thing. It's not just a simulacrum of the rich, sort of complex ingredients that life uses. Mathematically, it's the same sort of potentially. It's sort of like you've got a rich enough thing, this can produce. It's almost like it's naturally going to produce rich results. But how do you work with it? How do you steer with it? How do you navigate with it? How do you work creatively with it? Because that's the sort of real core of my practice. So it's always working with these systems, and then it's almost like all you're almost wanting is a system that's almost out of control. It's sort of like almost like richly bubbling away, trying to do crazy, interesting things, but it's almost often there's almost the tipping point of being out of control where it's most interesting, but also it's quite difficult to work with. It's like sort of like how do you, but almost like trying to push the system to points where it's going to be, so it's almost like, point where it's getting out of control. How do I bring it back, not under too much control, but how can I steer it? I guess some of the things. So there's a quote which I really like from Stuart Kauffman, who's one of the main sort of philosophers and who also, deals with sort of complexity and things like that. And basically, he was talking about the how in life what it's almost living systems often do is almost like take these rich systems and then peers often try to move them to the point where they're most complex, most richly out of control. So basically says the wonderful possibility to be held as a working hypothesis, bold but fragile, is that on many fronts, life evolves towards a regime that is poised between order and chaos. So the idea is that these systems, and generally what they'll do is most of the time either, not very much, be really boring, really predictable, or they're chaotic, which means they're effectively just totally out of control, or effectively almost random behavior. There's often a point between those two, where it's almost the really, really rich things start, particularly rich things start happening. There's an idea that the idea that things like in our brains and that the activation neurons, all these sorts of things are often seem to be naturally tuned to this point between order and chaos, which is where the interesting things happen, but also maybe it's quite challenging and difficult to work with the things which are at that sort of almost like threshold of going out of control. So I'm not sure how well this is going to play. So this is a video. I've slightly shrunk it down to try to make it work better online. Is that actually playing at all okay over Zoom? Okay, cool. So hopefully you can sort of see it's one of the simulations running, which is basically a simulation of cellular division happening. So it's a totally just computer done model rather than being anything that's a real cells. It's pure computer data, not being influenced by anything external. It's just pure data simulation, but hopefully produces a sort of surprising range of different structures and forms by being these very simplified almost rules of almost like inspired by nature, but not trying to copy nature, I guess is another thing. It's like, I'm not trying to make things which are going to be like a specific cell type growing, like a specific organism. What I'm more interested in is what's the nature of working with those sorts of ingredients, and what does it make? Does it make really crazy alien-like things? What other things can it make, or is it very familiar what it tends to produce? And what's involved in trying to, it's almost like an ongoing experiment. Is it science? Is this art? I don't know. It's what I'm interested in. So it's almost, I want it to surprise me. I'm not trying to make it do anything that I predict. I mean, there's almost a bit mixed ingredients in there where I'm thinking this hopefully is going to make more interesting results. But what I'm most deliberately wanting it to do is I want it to surprise me. I want it to do things like, I guess what I'm playing here. I can understand now when I see it, almost like why it might be doing those things, but it does lots of things which I really don't expect. All sorts of waves and patterns of behaviour and activity that go on in the solar system. So there's actually there's work from 5-6 years ago, sort of work called cellular forms, and a lot of my more recent work has been sort of almost like building on top of that and sort of like new variations, modifications, and sort of like trying to steer this in sort of different directions. But I'm going to focus on this because this is also the work that we've been using. We've gone back to with John McCormack for this research work that we've been doing recently. So basically, this is saying it's a very, very simplified, playing fast and loose, both with physics and biology. It's trying simulation of cellular growth. So the idea is you've got cells, and that cells split, and then split cells connect to each other, and they're basically these sort of forces and things like between the cells. So there's these are, I'm not going to go through lots of detail about these. Actually, if you go to my website, there's papers that I've written about this stuff with almost more the dirty details of the algorithms and things like that. But essentially, there's basically, it's a mesh, it's a sheet of cells, almost like a rubber sheet of cells with, and then there's rules for, how cells accumulate food. So things like light rays come in, simulated hitting the cells, and depending on how many light rays hit the cell, it generates food. And then that cell can either share food with its neighbors or be greedy and grab that food itself. And then when a cell has accumulated enough food, it's then grown enough, and it then splits into two cells. And splitting into two cells, you sort of have things like decide, okay, which direction is it going to split? How does that get affected? So there's got a lot of parameters, things that influence the system that maybe choose the direction it's going to split in different ways, by maybe being affected by the direction of most stretching in the sheet, or the directions of curvature in the sheet, and most curvature, least curvature. So quite a lot of things which potentially could influence the way that the cells split and grow. All of which are things which I think may be interesting, but I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, how they're going to, what the results are going to be. But maybe it's almost like, here's a sort of things to mix together. And a number of forces that you sort of like, you show these rules for cells split into two, and then there's that cell connects back into this mesh of cells. And there's forces, so almost like springs and what are called torsion springs, almost like bendy springs, and almost like things where the sheet of cells tries to flatten itself out. So there's quite a lot of various different influences on that sheet that hopefully are going to make it almost like change the dynamics, change the physics of how it behaves. So and images which come from just the same system. So it's almost just like these are just slightly different parameter values, was tweaking the controls on the synthesizer but with basically exactly the same code, exactly the same sort of simulation engine. And what you get I think, are maybe a sort of quite surprising range of different, hopefully surprisingly lifelike. Actually, one thing I've been finding is that almost everything it produces, well, mostly it produces things that looks like junk, just looks like a random mess of cells, or it explodes into just complete chaos. But when it doesn't, it seems to always produce things which look, or I think almost like remarkably familiar. I've been surprised by it, given how almost like, saying fast and loose I've been playing with the biology. It's like, this is astonishingly simplified mathematical system that I've been building. Also, I'm trying to do a system that can be iterated, can work with, typically these are about 50 million cells, and now I'm often working up to 100 or more million cells. I want to get to a sort of level of intricacy and detail where hopefully sort of almost aesthetically interesting things start happening. So, there's sort of a surprising range of different structures that can come from just like different parameters just within a single system without actually changing the code at all, just changing the strengths, the forces, the probability it's going to split in one direction rather than in another direction. Things like that can make almost like a surprisingly rich landscape of possibilities that it can get to. And I quite like this piece. This is actually one which I think is almost the least biological thing it's produced, which I think has, but isn't just a complete mess. But even that, I think, potentially looks like maybe an insect mandibles under an electron microscope or something like that. And things. So I was expecting a lot more crazy sci-fi alien things. But what I quite like is that what it makes often produces things that maybe has. Maybe a hybrid. It's a mixture of maybe different reminiscence. Maybe it looks a bit like, you think, oh, it looks like a brain. You realize, no, it doesn't. It looks all, it's sort of like it's sort of a mixture of different reminiscences maybe that you get from some of these forms. So what I'm doing with these is then within art context, I guess an art context is a great excuse to experiment, a great excuse to try things out, which maybe I wouldn't have permission to do if this was a pure science sort of project. It was like freedom to explore, freedom to experiment, freedom to try to find the unusual, maybe. So this is the sort of thing where this is actually an exhibition from a few years ago at Waterman's. Basically, I'm sort of turning into the artifacts in different ways. So like 2D prints, so 3D sculpture at the front there. I've got I've got a sculpture here. So this is one of my sort of like 3D printed sort of sculptures, and they're sort of like have a real quite interesting level of like detail and intricacy in there. And projections, videos, animations, often doing videos with almost like different views into the same data, but different aspects of the simulation, which hopefully reveal different details, different parts, the things that we've seen with the external structure, things we've seen the inside, things we're seeing the patterns of, almost like how old different cells are in the system. I think all those things can reveal different things. So I'm often deliberately trying to create almost like a range of artifacts from the same data, and they hopefully reveal different things. You notice different things. And then there are various variations on this. So they're called like plant-like forms, which are, the way things are just generally just growing upwards. So it's basically by constrained light to only come from certain directions. Suddenly it goes from everything being almost like pollen grain-like spheres to being these very plant and fungal-like sort of structures. And has a series called hybrid forms, which was starting to explore more than one cell type in the system. So where the cells almost like compete with each other for growth. So we've got two different cells which are growing, trying to almost like create different forms and structures, and maybe one has a slightly different growth rate than another. And they sort of compete with each other in the structure, which can adds, I was again genuinely surprised by how much more range of variety and structures you get from such a simple change to the system. And turn these into 3D printed structures, almost like thinking about the constraints of fabrication, the constraints of, in order to make this sort of almost try to make something that's going to grow, that's going to be naturally tend to be fabricable as a 3D printed form. What's involved in that, where you may often have to limit the amounts of overhang and things like that, and then that influences the system in ways that yields almost another rich sort of set of structures. And here's some which are almost like accidents, where I was trying to make things which would be 3D printable, and they made completely un-3D printable things, which I've then been presenting things like as stereoscopic installations. So I can't 3D print these, but they can exist three-dimensionally virtually. So if you saw the exhibition at the Barge House recently, that had things like, this sort of stereo viewer in there. So that's sort of the context of the art practice. Obviously, then the backstory, which I have talked about a bit before, I had a paper at Geneva a few years ago about a thing I've written called SpeciesExplorer. And the work I've been doing with John McCormack is basically about trying to take that further, trying to take that, how do we get even, hopefully into even more understanding of what's called the landscape. So basically, SpeciesExplorer is some software that I've written. So it's almost my collaborator, my partner. It's almost like this is what I use to try to find the parameters where interesting things actually happen. So it's basically an interface that allows me to things like rate and categorize things. So I can try out lots of different things, and then I can sort of see, what I'm showing here is the interface where it's almost like the scores from 0 to 10. So I can just sort of say, okay, that's really interesting. That was junk. That was junk. That didn't even finish the simulation. Get out of 0. That's sort of interesting. Get out of 3 or 4. Or that. Oh, I really like that. I don't know why, but I just like that. Get out of even an 8. Get out of 9. So it allows me to rate things, and also put things into categories, which I can then use to as almost data to try to then try to sort of almost let the computer suggest new parameters to try. So it's almost like, and it's got papers about this if you wanted to go online and find more details about it. But basically what I'm using is a range of different techniques, including what's called interactive genetic algorithms, but also it was like machine learning techniques. So basically it's almost by me having rated and categorized a few things. The idea is that it starts to learn to be able to predict at a new set of parameter values, is that likely to be something that I like or not? And it can sort of steer the search into that direction. So I'm using, say, things that are just like, generate parameter values purely randomly, using sort of like these genetic algorithm sort of techniques, which are almost taking a leaf out of how evolution works, but as a sort of on a computer. And also I've been using these machine learning methods, but generally what a very simple, crude method, what's called k-nearest neighbors, which is just literally, as almost I say, the new point in the parameter space. Basically look at the nearest other things that you've already created as parameter values and predict the next, predict it based on just, what are the other nearby things you've already found. So it's almost say, here's a new set of parameters. Just look for which of the other nearest samples you've already found, and your prediction is going to be close to those. So ridiculously simple, very fast, but one of the big questions is, can we do better? Is there better stuff to predict things? One of the things I'm trying to use that for is to find these sort of transition points, find these tipping points, I was almost like saying between order and chaos. Where this is like a plot from work I did quite a few years ago. And I guess what you're sort of seeing here is that there's sort of behavior, which on the left-hand side is sort of like, starts almost, they're all quite similar to each other, and it's slowly changing. And as you move to the right-hand side, and it tips over into actually instability, and just these pieces almost started pulling themselves apart, too many forces. But there's almost like a transition point between the two, where the interesting things that happen. Actually, I should minimize that. See my screen. I see my screen a bit better. Right? So yeah, it was how do I actively try to find those transition points? One sort of big thing. And can we? And the research question is trying to work with John McCormack was, can we use deep neural nets as a way to directly try to sort of like make this help this process, help explore the sort of space of possibilities that we come out with these systems, in particular potentially for these things of looking for sort of tipping points. So the one of the things here is, I guess what I've got in SpeciesExplorer is this system that allows me to rate and categorize things. What I found was that putting things into categories is actually, it becomes really quite difficult. It's almost like I might have generated 1,000 samples, and then I want to put in categories, but I want to be playful with it. I want to try different things out. I want to make it as easy as possible putting these categories, and just manually putting things into categories is just takes a long time. And the truth is, I did it for one series, which is basically this original cellular form series. And then I almost never use it again since, because it just takes so long. And then once I've put things into categories, it's so rigid. It's just like, well, what happens if I want to change it? What do I want to modify it? Or do I have to then recategorize everything again by hand? So the idea was that putting things in categories is maybe a really useful, rich data to help search for things like points of transition from one behavior to another, because you almost can, by being in categories, it's almost like you can express what is a change, whether it's a change, what it's placed in the parameters where what you go from one category of behavior to another category of behavior. But what I was finding with my interface was that it was just like painfully slow, and and that's what they would call user fatigue setting. But basically, it's almost like if I just got it, if I'm generating things, I'm just getting a few tens or 100 samples every night, and that's quite quick to categorize. But if I've got like 1,500 samples, that's going to take a long time. If I then get halfway through it and decide, actually, I haven't changed my mind, I want to try something different. So it's almost like, how do I make this easy, quick, playful? Was the sort of like a big question I was trying to say, okay, is there a way we can make this? So I want to be able to categorize things easily. I want to make more use of categories. How can we work with this? So as I said, the only time I really did go in and categorize the data from my simulations was back actually, I see this original cellular forms. So that's basically why we went back to this with John. Because I said, well, okay, I've got this one data set, which is about 1,700 of images and samples, which I had already got, where I'd rated every one of these images, these pictures that are rendered from a value from 0 to 10, almost like my aesthetic ranking, which ones I like, which ones I don't like, which ones I'm sort of thinking are a bit in between. But I'd also put all these categories, these images into categories, which I've named things like animal and balloon and brain and plant and worms and mess. So I'd already got this data set. Could we use this? Could we experiment with this? So what we first wanted to address is very much stuff that John did, was saying, okay, there's techniques using new modern machine learning, using neural networks to do things like take a data set and automatically try to see whether you can almost like just throw this data at a neural net and see what it tries to understand, what it makes, can it make sense of the data? So this is using techniques of what's called things like dimension reduction. So it's almost like taking lots and lots of dimensions that you've potentially got in like your images and trying to reduce them to what it sees as being the small number of just 2 dimensions, because that's what humans can look at as a picture and make sense of. By the time you reduce it to 2 dimensions, is there structure that the neural net can extract almost automatically? So you're almost looking for clustering. And these are the sort of plots we found, which basically is sort of saying that it was basically based on the original parameters used to drive the simulation, what we call the genotype space. There really wasn't any structure that just almost like trying to throw this automatically at a neural net can make sense of it. So you sort of see this sort of like scatter at the top, where almost all the different categories just seem to be just like combined with each other without any clear sort of separation of them. Doing it on sort of phenotype space, which means looking at the images instead. There is some categorization, but when you actually look at it, most of those categories are actually just the ones which were just completely black images, or ones where the simulation had just exploded. Most of the interesting categories were still just mixed in with each other. So basically, using some automatic dimension reduction methods, we didn't seem to be able to make you get much sense from out of the data. So then we looked at was we used neural nets to more almost emulate what I was doing when rating and categorizing things. So where I'm sort of like, I've got a set of parameters. Well, we've got a set of parameters. We've run this simulation system that's generated a 3D structure, generated an image, using this from that structure. And then I would be looking at that image, going, "I'll give that a 7 out of 10, and I think that looks like coral." So could we use a neural network? Or how good could a neural network be at doing a similar sort of rating categorization, but based just on me having rated and categorized a few things? So almost like, how can I train this with just a small number of things and get, sort of like, how easy is it to get a neural net to, replicate me? Or it's not, I guess what it's not doing is it's not coming up with its own original aesthetic judgment. It's more trying to say, I've given it a few examples of saying, hey, these 5 things, I call those coral-like. Is that enough for it to then look at the lots of other images and go, hey, that's another thing that you would call a coral? So what we used for this was a neural network type, which is called ResNet 50. That's like one of the main neural nets that's currently used for sort of image classification. So this is one of these lots of competitions of neural nets competing against each other and things like that. And ResNet 50 is a network that's basically been trained against a ridiculous number of images originally. So it's basically trained on what's called the ImageNet database, which has over 1 million images in it. And it's basically this sort of network of lots of artificial neurons feeding into each other, feeding into each other, feeding into each other. So you feed an image in one side, and then by the time it gets to the other end of the network, it's hopefully classifying those things, say, that's a face, that's a bicycle, that's a tabby cat. So it's basically just having to sort of categorize the images. And what's really good about or interesting lot of research about things like ResNet 50, and there's quite a lot of other image classifiers a bit like that, is that almost like once you've trained it on a huge number of images, what you can often then do is just retrain the last few layers to categorize new data. So it's almost like the network's already learnt how to see interesting features and detail in images, almost extract the information that is then just with a very small number of extra neurons, almost what we call here the classifier. So the ResNet 50 model, that's the big thing that almost like has learnt how to extract useful features from images. And then the last thing, the classification, which is typically like 2 or 3 layers at the end, is the thing that then takes what's called those features and just divides it up into all the different categories. The idea is if I've got some new images that I want to categorize differently, all I potentially need to do is just retrain those last few layers. So it's almost like it's almost like it's learned already to see. What I'm now trying to do is tell it how to see the things that I'm interested in. The other thing we used was, so that was almost like saying ResNet 50 is really good for image classification. You have to feed images into it, but hopefully it can then be trained to classify and potentially also score things. The other thing we looked at was more general neural networks. So basically what's called I think we just like fully connected hidden layers. So basically you just say like, I want this to have 4 layers, each layer has 100 neurons in, and then basically this is my number of inputs, this is my number of outputs, connect absolutely everything up to everything, and then I can train that to do new things. So this is more training from complete scratch. So one of the good things being like ResNet 50 is that it's already been trained how to see. You're almost only needing to tell it how to see the new the things you're interested in. if you haven't got something like image data, so you've just got things like, what the parameters of my simulation systems, then you have to use something more like these fully connected deep neural nets. It's almost like there's no useful information by just looking at all the images on Facebook and things like that to train this with. I've just got my parameters, which are things like, how much the different strengths of forces between cells, how cooperative or selfish the cells are, and things like that. How those parameters link to the different ratings and categorizations, who knows? So I've almost got to train everything from scratch. So that's where using basically what they call these fully connected deep neural networks is maybe an alternative thing if I basically want to get predictions just from my parameter values rather than from looking at the final image results. Hopefully that's all sort of makes sense. So I'm not going to try to kill you by looking at just like academic data, but this is sort of just like the summary of the results we got of training the ResNet 50 system against with the categories that I'd given, and also training ResNet 50 to try to do the scores like I was doing from 0 to 10, and with the tabular model, which is a fully connected network, and then comparing that with the very, very simple nearest neighbors system that I've been previously using in SpeciesExplorer. And basically the results are that if you give it the images to look at, ResNet 50 actually, I think, is really surprisingly good. It's actually was putting things into the same category that I had subjectively 87% of the time. And when we got it trying to give scores similar to the scores that I was giving to forms, it's we'll say the root mean error, which means the difference between the scores I gave and the average difference between the scores I gave it and what this neural net was coming up with was less than 1. It was basically usually, even if I was giving like scores from 0 to 10, the neural net is basically getting scores usually within one category, one rank number. So I might give it a 6, and it's usually sort of like a 5, 6, or 7. So it's sort of surprisingly, especially when you think that these categories and ranks are pretty subjective. There probably isn't any fully accurate way of predicting them because it's me doing them. It might depend on my mood, might depend on how bored I am of seeing things that look like cauliflower. The first cauliflower I see, I might rate very highly. After I've seen 300 cauliflowers, I might be rating them very low. So we were quite surprised about how accurate the predictions were, basically based on the image data. And then we also looked at the predicting it based on the original parameters. And we're actually getting not quite as good predictions, but still think surprisingly good. So we're getting about sort of nearly 70% accuracy of predicting which category something would be in, just by looking at the parameter values before you've run the simulation. So just looking at the parameter values feeding into the simulation, the neural net was getting almost nearly 70% accuracy, whereas the nearest neighbors thing that I've been using previously was only about 50%. And also the accuracy of scoring it would predict would usually within about 2 score values, whereas nearest neighbors were roughly about 3 values. So basically significantly better predictions also for stuff that's also coming from the original parameters that I'm using to drive the system. So basically, before it's even run the simulation engine, a deep neural net is coming up with a pretty good prediction of what the results are likely to be. So basically what we looked into was then integrating this stuff. And this is actually still a work in progress, but I'm just going to talk about a few things we've done so far, sort of integrating these systems back into my SpeciesExplorer software. So the first one is just making categorization easier and quicker. So this is a new panel in SpeciesExplorer called the Categoriser. And basically what we're seeing here is the neural net having predicted lots of different samples as which category it thinks things will go into. And also the chart effectively puts everything from the things on green on the left are the things where it's really sure, it thinks it's got that category really right. And things on the right-hand side with the sort of like blues and purples around the thumbnails are the things where it's put it into that category. It thinks it's like a brain-like structure, but it's not really sure. It thinks it's close to being in a different category as well. So what you're getting is hopefully is an idea of how well is it starting to predict things, and where is it making clear errors, which are maybe the things that I need to correct. So hopefully I can just quite quickly just give it a few examples. It then gives me a chart like this, almost like it shows me how it would now categorize things. And I can basically totally see where is it going clearly wrong, correct those things, now train it again. And it only takes a few minutes to retrain the neural net, just the last few layers. And I'm hoping you can now get to, it only feels like fun. It's sort of like iterating, almost like playing with this game of trying to get the categories better, rather than just going, I'll give that a balloon, I'll give that a balloon. So I think it's almost like, I find it more fun to work with, which is maybe quite a big thing. And also it feels like hopefully a lot less samples. I can just give it, I can quickly see when is it trained enough? If it's not, if it's making mistakes, where is it making mistakes? Correct a few things. So hopefully make it really fast. And one thing I'm now working on is now to also then potentially like divide up into different categories, try out different things, hopefully be much more experimental, sort of with trying things. Well, what if I break the animal things into 3 different categories? Because actually, there's quite a lot of things, or combine those 2 categories together and do different things with it. The next one I think is even more potentially interesting is what's called genotype space plots. So this is the predictions based if I change the parameters, what it thinks the results will be. So what we're sort of showing here is a chart where the light blue things are where parameter values that it thinks will produce a brain-like structure. The yellow things are things where it thinks it can make what I call an animal-like structure. Red is a balloon-like structure. The black bits are the things where no image gets rendered, the simulation fails, so ends up just with a black image. So what I'm starting to see is this is just the neural net predicting at new parameter values what it thinks the category will be. And then I can just click on these charts. So these are basically like cross sections through the parameter space. And I can sort of see maybe where there are potentially interesting transition points. And then I can just like click on this chart and say, now generate me something that looks like there's a potential transition there from balloon-like to brain-like. Well, let's try it out. Let's see. Okay, so I can hopefully almost navigate to places where these transition states may happen much more directly, or at least where it's predicted to happen. If I haven't given it enough examples yet, its predictions are probably going to be really bad, but they're probably going to be the best predictions based on the information I've given it so far. And then gradually, as I give it more and more information, try things out, it's hopefully going to get better and better. But hopefully what this is already allowing me to do is much more genuinely make the best predictions, best use of the data it's given me so far. And then the final thing I'm going to show you is almost more automatic search, where it's almost just like we just give it 2 places in the parameter space and 2 samples. So it's almost like it's found 2 things. So the 2 things on the left-hand side are 2 simulations we've already run. One we've categorized as balloon-like, the other one we've categorized as brain-like. And then what we can do is just set the system off and it tries to find a transition between the 2 automatically. So it's basically producing the parameter values halfway between the 2, runs the simulation, renders the image, and then the neural net can look at that, tries to categorize that, and depending how it categorizes that, I then decide, okay, well, that's a new brain-like thing. Okay, now let's make that the thing to the right. So now let's look at let's now generate a new sample halfway between the original balloon and the new thing, which I think is a brain, and just keep almost like looking between the 2, just almost like thinking, like, is it still brain-like? Is it now balloon-like? Let's still narrow the interval between the 2 down smaller and smaller and smaller until hopefully I find a transition. And it might work, it might not work, but this is an example where it actually has produced something which is potentially a bit of a hybrid between these 2. It's almost found a point in the parameters where balloon-like behaviour seems to transition into brain, or maybe that's animal-like. But it's interesting. I think it's interesting. I mean, it's really ugly, but I really like ugly. There's something about that that's, I think it's sort of unexpectedly rich coming from the system, rather than just being the typical behaviour that you get at most places. So I think this is an interesting way to more directly navigate straight to potential transition points. So, okay, that's the end of the presentation. So this very much is still a work in progress, but already seems to be producing, I think, interesting results, and hopefully is going to make me braver to work with these systems to, almost just like, look for these points of transition, points of hopefully the unexpected, unusual behaviour, rather than just the typical behaviour out of these other sorts of systems. Okay, right. Hopefully that came through okay.
Yes, thank you very much. That's very interesting indeed. I think, like we did before, what I think I'll do, I have a question that I'm dying to ask you, but I'm sure others do as well. So if I can ask my question, and then if others are thinking about any other questions, they can either let me know in the comments that they want to ask, and I'll sort of make you active, or you can wave at me, or you maybe just start talking. Let's see what happens. So while everyone else is thinking of their questions, the thought that I had was that your work fits very much in the generative art canon. You're generating these shapes, and often as generative artists do something I call, they say they have the sort of gardener approach, in that the generative system creates a space, a world of images, and then the role of the artist is to choose those ones that they particularly like. So you might get 100 images generated, and you choose the one that you think expresses or captures everything you're interested in. Now, it strikes me that what you're doing is you're bringing the computer into that space. The computer is not only growing the shapes, but it's also the gardener selecting them. So my question is, what's the relationship between you, the artist, and the artwork if the machine is selecting shapes? Or maybe I'm misinterpreting that.
No, I think that's a good question. I mean, the way I see it is that I'm still very much in the loop, and that's what I'm interested in. Is with the system. That's what I'm more interested in. I'm not interested in it having automatically come up with its own aesthetics and things like that. I think there was some really interesting research work to be done in that whole area. That, and the questions about that, about what does that mean for human creativity and things like that, I think are really interesting. But I guess I'm more interested in, the sorts of these rich, complex, almost like say the sorts of ingredients that life uses. How can we work with those? And so it's also to keep us almost like, how can we work creatively with that sort of thing? And it feels like a collaboration to me, that the computer isn't making the aesthetic judgment, but it's helping me navigate that space. It's almost like, it feels almost like mapping tools. And the more it learns, the more it becomes a more active collaborator. But it's an active collaborator having learned from me. So it's almost discovering fitness. It's discovering what I think is aesthetic or not through a learning process. And then the more it learns that, the more it can actively collaborate. So maybe it feels like a good research student. That's in my mind. But I'm still maybe like running the research project. And I guess that's one, and then even going further, that's where I'm interested in always keeping me in the loop. But it's almost there's some things that the computer can do really well that I can't. It's like working in multiple dimensions. I mean, human brains, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, do plots, you can work with them. Bigger dimensions, I can't. If I've got 50 parameters, I've got no idea where to go with it. But that's where things like these techniques using deep neural nets, things like that, they can potentially work with these spaces that don't make sense to our human brains, but can make sense to them. And I'm interested in how this collaboration becomes an ongoing thing.
That's very interesting, because I think sometimes there is like 2 trends in what you might say AI techniques. One of them is towards this idea that the computer will somehow replace humans, be it in their replacing our physical sense, but also our mental activities. Whereas I think there's the side that a lot of us here might prefer, which is the idea that the computer will assist and augment human intelligence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So computers will always be good at doing things that computers are good at, and humans will always be good at doing things that humans are good at. There may be some overlap, but really the best result is the two working together.
Yeah, and I think my prediction, this will be a relationship between us and computers that is going to change and change and change over time. But yeah, that's sort of, yeah, it's sort of it's almost like it's into transhumanism and things like that, doesn't it? There's this, augmented human, which I guess we're already augmented by, mobile phones, things like that. They allow us to do things which we would not have been able to do before. And I guess that's also core. What I'm interested in is how does this sort of technology enable us to do things which we could not even think about doing otherwise?
Very interesting.
I mean, sorry, I've got a question.
Yeah.
You've got two sort of views on computers as assistants. On the one hand, you've got the McLuhan view of the computer, an extension of ourselves. But of course, we've also got the Foucault saying technology is control, and actually, when you're using this computer assistant, it's actually constraining the avenues in which you can exercise choice. I just wondered what obviously you've chosen this rich parameter space.
Yeah.
But to what extent are you then being constrained within that parameter space?
Okay, well, all right. Yeah, that's good. Very good question. But I think that there's two things. Well, almost like that, because I've written the code doesn't mean I'm in control of it. Almost like I can't predict what it's going to do. So I would say that the things like using these deep neural nets, using SpeciesExplorer, allows me to explore further than I would otherwise. So actually, in some ways, I think that's the opposite of control. It's not, and also it's a ratio where it's if I try to over control it, I throw the baby out with the bathwater. That it's just like all it does is the uninteresting stuff. So it's like but also I don't feel that I feel it's actually enabling me rather than controlling me. Maybe I'm completely deluded, and it's the AI has taken over.
It's not so much that, it's
but it feels to me like an appropriate collaboration.
Yeah, we have a question here, I think, from Ernest, who I'm sure will say some interesting things. So I've just unmuted you, I think, Ernest. Unmute. There we go. I think you should be able to speak now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Andy, so I had another follow-on question from the same vein, really. If I put it really simply, what I thought you were doing, apart from generating images by computer that maybe you think were aesthetically interesting, that's the first step. But then you've used techniques from neural nets I thought, to try to narrow down the field that you then had to choose from, basically. And the way you seemed to do that was by training the system with your aesthetic judgment on training sets, so that then it could kind of say, well, we'll throw away all this stuff, and now these are the ones you're more likely to like. And that may not be quite right, but it's certainly oversimplified, but I look at it a little bit like that. And then that led to a question, which is this. It seems to me that the lifelong quest of an artist is usually to try to understand the aesthetics and develop their aesthetic judgment, and in fact change and refine their aesthetic judgment. And so I wonder whether using training sets and learning algorithms, using machine learning, might not have a very conservative influence on your work, in that it narrows it down to the kind of things that you liked yesterday. And to what extent does it help you find the new things that you're going to like and discover tomorrow?
That's it. I think that's a good, very, very good question. Well, hopefully at least this works and provokes that discussion. Actually, I think I might be getting feedback. Can you mute yourself, Ernest?
I'm just going to mute you.
Yeah, I'm just getting feedback, I think, in the system. Right. So I think there is the trying to make the system automatically look for transitions is that I agree, is in a sense narrowing the search, that it's sort of saying I want it to look for transition states and show me those preferentially. So yeah, I think I totally agree with you there, that is sort of narrow states, but I think it does have potential for more variety, more interest. And I mean, I think that those are the things places where I think the unexpected generally happens. So trying to get it to more create the particularly unexpected results for me to have a look at. Hopefully, it actually makes me want to explore further. It's the danger with a lot of generative systems is you get to the point where you think you just now know what this does and you're a bit bored by it. Whereas maybe using something like this will help you go further with it and find things which you wouldn't because of user fatigue, because of you just becoming like, okay, I'm not finding the things that make me excited. It's interested. So yeah, I think I can see. I agree that it's biasing the search in a particular way, and maybe there is a question about is it just me that thinks that transition states are interesting? Yeah, maybe, but maybe it's a reflection of my values. Other parts of this, I mean, still this is quite exploratory research. Another part of this, I think, the more just pure prediction of behaviour. To give you a more sense of the possibility, the landscape, that can also be used in also a less biased way. So it's almost just like me seeing what is. It's almost just like, but I'm going into uncharted territory. Helping to chart what the territory may be like can maybe help me navigate however I want within that territory. So I think there's some more biased bits and some bits which are maybe more just, it's using that information to help explore differently, a bit like as an archaeologist maybe digging a trench or something like that. So yeah, I think this could go in different directions that way. Or the other big thing I'm starting to feel, so this is just is that particularly the categorization stuff, making that playful, making you want to change, try things out, not think trying out a new way of arranging them was like the tiles, is from it being painfully slow to being I can do this and I can be playful, I can just try something out quickly and let's see. I think actually that might help me develop my aesthetic values further, because it's almost like having a playful approach and to try things out differently, because I can just give it a few examples and then see what that does. So yeah, I think that part particularly is always like, I think I agree on maybe just the ranking stuff, but the category things, I think actually that maybe takes you further into an aesthetic. Rather than just being like, don't like, it's taking you into maybe more nuances of difference. And, and once it was like divide things up and then divide them up even more and divide them up even more and getting into more and more, so maybe nuanced behavior. I think actually, this is still very early days with it, but I think there's a potential for it helping me understand more and actually develop my sense even deeper, I think. Maybe that's for a talk for another year. Yeah,
I think that's very interesting. I've got a few more questions here that I'll just read out, maybe sort of quick fire questions. Eva Pascoe would like to just note that actually this is sort of quite reminiscent of William Latham's Organic and Evolutionary Art in the 80s. And I was thinking the same, the Mutator software.
Yeah.
And of course, William. So I wonder.
I do know William. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's connections there, and I've known William since the early 90s. I actually did my master's research project at IBM. We're in the same group that William and Stephen Todd were in at IBM. Yes, there's connection and differences. I mean, actually, we often compare things. I think I'm probably more interested in like emergent things from very low level behaviour. And I guess William comes from more a sculpture background, and it's also like sculptural forms which can be mutated and bred together and things like that. So I think there's always like comes from a different place, but maybe to a similar or point where there are similarities in the two. Also, I guess I did try out using Mutator way back in the early 90s when I was at IBM on a couple of things, and I actively use mutation and crossbreeding and things like that as one of the techniques in my SpeciesExplorer software. But there's also a thing I find. It's actually one thing that there's been a sort of researchers have done research today. So behaviour, something called user fatigue in using interactive genetic systems like Mutator. I think it depends what you're trying to do. I find those sort of systems very often quite good for really refining things or really early exploration. But often, if you're looking for particular novelty and things like that, sometimes it feels like it's a very difficult system to work with. So that's where I'm often wanting almost like a variety of different techniques that I can try to use. So I'm actively still use and interested in carrying on using genetic algorithm style approaches like Mutator. But I'm also very interested in machine learning like based things. And I guess one quite provocative question here is almost that saying, nature shows that genetic algorithm-like approaches work. That's sort of how evolution works. But can we do better? Or can you do better? Can machine learn more direct machine learning methods? And somebody can argue that genetic algorithms are a form of machine learning. But if you were just doing, just want to open up to all sorts of other machine learning techniques, can you work with those similar sort of rich, complex systems that life uses ingredients, but work with them more, creatively, more? This is probably huge hubris. Can we as humans outperform, working with AI techniques, outperform evolution?
That's quite ambitious.
Yeah, but it's nice and nice and provocative.
Great. I'll move on to a couple more questions. Simon Ray would like to know: is colour ever one of your parameters?
Is colour my parameters? I do have renders with colour, so it's not probably one of the parameters. I've never had it as one of the parameters that feeds into the system. I guess I'm usually more interested in form. I guess. But I have used colour in the artifacts at the end. So often there's maybe using colour to show the age of shells. So using colour to show the curvature, the tension, to almost like parameters for the system, and then does that to almost reveal different structures and things in the form that you wouldn't have been aware of. So I've used colour in the art. I do a lot of black and white. But I also do some color as well on the artifacts. But I've never had color as a parameter that is one of the original inputs to the system, I guess.
Okay, a couple more actually. Okay, so well, Graham, do you want to ask the question yourself here? You'll just have to I can make you active. Quite a long question.
Potentially. I was fascinated by your presentation there, Andy. I just wanted to ask, in terms of your input data to the AI, were you giving it any potential for function or choices of an environmental habitat, or were you just literally looking at the cell division itself with no specific evolutionary need for the cells to come into being?
So the fitness of the structure is just this data is just me saying I give that a 7, I give that a 2. There wasn't any environment rule effects in that one. Some of the other systems on the ones I've used actually are stuff for these sort of more vase-like structures. In some ways, that has a sort of version of more environment-like things. So things like that there's the influence of overhangs and things like that. So it's almost more it's not doing a full structural simulation, but it's sort of things which are relating to the form of the final structure affect things like growth rates and things like that. So that there's, and actually some of the earlier work, the aggregation series, I saw the things that I used to change and modify and was exploring was, as far as I was seeing, was environmental rules as changing the environment that the form was growing in. So yeah, I'm interested in those, and actually particular for how do you make structures that become it was like maintain really interesting diversity and richness. I think that, you know, the influence of the environment as it grows is a huge thing in that. What I've also been surprised by is how far I've managed to get without using that. But so I'm sort of always doing little baby steps. So I thought I'd need much more of things like that. With the vase form things, I'm already starting to get environment back in there again.
If I dared to go further with that question, do you think the AI understood the parameters if you gave it those?
I think understanding is maybe the wrong word. I don't feel that it understands, but it, you know, it just. It's obviously such a mathematical prediction. I always feel slightly worried about using the term AI, to be honest. I'm one of those people that always says machine learning generally rather than AI, apart from when I'm trying to be a bit provocative. I see these as being, you know, it's a system that can predict based on training data, which is, you know, you can use, and sometimes really the clarity of seeing it that way maybe can make you use that in, you know, interesting ways. So I don't think it understands anything, but because it can predict in things like far more dimensions than my brain can work in, it's a really useful tool. And because it starts becoming a better and better predictor, there is almost like a relationship changes. It's sort of working with it. It feels like goes from being a totally dumb tool to becoming, feels that it's probably anthropomorphizing it far too much. You start feeling more like a collaboration because it's sort of helping me, I think, find things that I wouldn't be able to find otherwise.
Thank you.
I'll just go through a couple more of the questions here. So here's a sort of observation really that you're from Daniela. Your artwork seems to raise ontological questions in ethics, philosophy, or even religion. And I think that's often the case with work, machine learning or AI work, where you're creating these extremely large, complicated spaces and trying to navigate around them. It does enter that sort of area, really.
I think yes. I come from a very, very humanist, perspective, and the almost like the what could similar things to the ingredients of life, but creates by, and how much steering of them is needed to make them do rich, interesting things is obviously a philosophical, gets into philosophy as well, as well as just complex system stuff. Very right, really, because it's how much do you need to tip things to go from chemistry to life?
Well, I think maybe just simple enough to say that life is it's a law of one of the laws of nature. It happens when the chemistry is right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel that enough chemistry produces a complex system of self-catalyzing reaction things, and then you do absolutely need something which steers that through things like selection. So have it, but is it enough by the time you got? Can you get to the point where you got chemicals with some form of self-replication, so that what proliferates more and more and more, and you get this almost like exponential sort of like chain reaction of proliferation through just because it replicates. I think so. I think it's probably life, I think, can happen spontaneously.
A question here from Erica, who says she didn't really understand in your talk. Does your research question relate to the object, the vase object? I think the vase is one form, isn't it? One product of your research, not the only product or the main product.
Yeah, I mean, what else? The vase forms is done with pre-deep neural net SpeciesExplorer. So currently we've only used the deep neural nets on the going right back to this original cellular forms data, because that was the only data set where I had categorized everything. Now we're interested in how do we go further with this, which I think potentially does get into more actually environmental things and things like that as being what goes into it. Is actually one of the main things I'm interested in with that.
Okay, well, I think maybe I'll ask, actually, one more question from me, really, which is often we wonder what makes digital art. You know, why is this a digital artwork, not just an artwork? Why is it a computer artwork and so on? What is the thing that makes computer artwork different to other art forms? And I think with your work, it wouldn't be possible to construct or explore these worlds and shapes without the computer. The computer is the device that makes it possible. So in a very real sense, your work is computer art where the computer is necessary. Would you agree?
I guess I'd feel it's one of those things where computational art is probably what I'm even more comfortable with it. It's that there is a process of computation to create this, which is why I say like my very like wanting to come from as simple rules as possible, but then iterated millions and millions of times. That's something that you can come up with physical systems to do, but I'd say they are computing systems. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be digital, but what I'm interested in is emergence through computation.
Yeah. And hence the sort of radical changes in the availability of computation and its price have been very important. Getting tiny computers the size of a credit card that can compute in ways that you couldn't imagine 20 years ago is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the, that, particularly when you get to like GPUs and things like that, these are way more powerful than the biggest supercomputers in the world not that many years ago, just for running a computer game usually. So it's thanks to computer gamers largely that I feel it's almost like it's almost like Alan Turing stuff, and it's like the vision he had of what to use. Okay, you made this computing machine, what to use it for, and the idea that you could start to by running it just digitally, you are actually doing the same processes as nature does. I mean, it's like but you actually need to get to a certain level of complexity, which that's what a GPU starts to get you towards being able to do. So yeah, I'm very happy that all those computer gamers have brought this stuff down from being millions and millions of pounds, and you need to be deeply embedded in a research group and begging for time on the ridiculously huge supercomputer to I've got one of my machines in the corner there is like a water-cooled dual GPU, which actually one of those things is that this is the technology you need both for doing this sort of like simulation stuff and for doing machine learning. It's the same ridiculous amounts of number crunching.
Great. So do we have any more questions?
I guess there's one quick question I saw from Nicola saying, why not use novelty search? I could get on to quite a long answer about that. I really won't do. I guess the quick answer is that novelty search does understand it. You have to have a feature vector that has a very low dimension, and how you find that feature vector is really not obvious in most creative systems. So if you have such a feature vector, you can use the papers on novelty search. But it's almost like, I don't know what a low dimensional feature vector is until maybe that's what we discover by looking at the system and starting to categorize it. But from start with my simulation system, I've got no idea what to put into the novelty search. So actually, this is a big question. I had a paper in A-Life last year. That was a question that came up with that. If you want to look at my paper from last year from A-Life, I do talk about novelty search in there a bit.
great. And all of these papers and so on can be found on the website, on your website?
Yeah, there should be. If they aren't, that's me having forgotten to put something up there. But yeah, certainly the everything and videos. Actually, also there's a video because Evo Musart had to happen online. We had to do recordings for the presentations. So yeah, I've put if you want the slightly more technical version of this, there's a video up on YouTube of the presentation that we gave at Evo Musart.
Yeah, well, maybe send me the link and I'll pop it in the video notes for this when it goes up on YouTube as well.
Sure, will do. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you a virtual round of applause, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's obviously going on slightly more geeky than some of these things, but yeah, hopefully it sort of, hopefully it's relevant to my art practice.
Okay, so before we finish, just a few things. And so we're back on this season 2 now. So we have 3 talks, and followed by the short talks. Next week we have Genetic Moo, who I think fair to say, Nicola, you're also interested in artificial life, but in a very much looking at how the environment interacts, or how the things interact with their environment and the extended environment. So I think that should be an interesting follow-on from this. So Genetic Moo will be talking 8 o'clock on Tuesday next week. And then the Saturday after, which is the 23rd, I want to make sure, yes, that's right. They're going to be running a live event on the Saturday evening at 8 o'clock, which is Micro World at Home. And I've been involved doing a little bit of work with them on sort of testing out some of the weird and wonderful things they've been making. So you'll hear all about Micro World at Home next week in their talk. And then if you're available on the Saturday, you can watch, I think it'll be about 2 hours long. Maybe Nicola, if you want to come in and say anything, you can. But I think it'll be a couple of hours live performance, certain amounts of interactivity, maybe grab a glass of wine and watch or participate. So I can unmute you, Nicola, if you wanted to quickly say something.
No, thanks.
So Nicola, you're now unmuted.
It's not Nicola, Sean, it's Tim.
Oh, Tim, hi. Oh, do you want to say anything about next week then?
Well, what you've said is right. We will be trying out live demos, and everyone will have a chance, if they can, to contribute something remotely, which can arrive into our space and interact with our creatures. So we will be testing that out, that live participation out as well, and then doing it on a further Saturday on a kind of more relaxed basis, I suppose.
Yeah, so the talk will be this time next week, and then the live event the following Saturday. So make a note of those. They're on the CAS website, and there will be links to sign up. I think we'll probably run a Zoom session at the same time, so you can switch between watching the stream of the live event, live performance, and then you can have a chat with people who are in the audience as well. So I'm just typing in the web address of the Computer Art Society, and I've spelled it. Yep, so you'll see all the information there. And if you're a Facebook user, follow the Computer Art Society Facebook page. That always has events on. And if I can get, and then of course, I'm going to be putting this up on the YouTube channel as well. And then I think just to say, we have the talk after that. So not next week, the week after is Boredom Research. You've been here tonight. In fact, I didn't realize it, but I've put together a bit of an artificial life sort of set this time, because I think Boredom Research's work takes another approach on looking at how natural forms inspire computer artworks. So yeah, it's a little bit of a theme. I didn't actually think about it at the time. And then, like I say, the one after, I'll be talking about the Computer Arts Archive project. So I think that's probably everything. I'm doing a few things locally in Leicester, where I'm based, and what I'll do is I'll share the events with people. So these are events working with some local artists, and we're going to be doing music events and live events. I'll share them on the Facebook page and on the CAS website. So if people fancy coming along to those, that would be great. And then if you wanted to give a short talk, I think maybe we had 9 last time, it was quite a lot. Maybe we'll try to keep to the 6, but we might give you a little bit more time. So if you fancied a 10 to 15 minute talk, as part of the short talk season, do let me know. Once the slots are filled, they've been filled. So if you're really keen on doing one, maybe let me know sooner rather than later. I shall pop my email address in the chat there. So feel free to drop me a line. Okay, well, I think that's everything. And unless there are any last minute vital questions from people, do wave. We'll stop for now and reconvene next week at 8 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Okay, bye. See you all. Great. See you next time.